Eleanor Vane, Duchess of Wexcombe, did not scream when her husband's open hand crossed her face in front of 40 guests. She did not stumble against the table she had laid herself that morning, counting each fork twice, each glass rim wiped clean of dust with her own handkerchief. She did not weep, though the hall had gone the particular silence of a room deciding, in real time, whether it was permitted to look away. She lifted 2 fingers to the sting along her cheekbone, once, lightly, the way a woman checks a fact she already suspects to be true, and then let her hand fall back to her side. The ribbon at her throat had snapped in the turning. Her father's seal ring, brass, unfashionable, the one thing of his she had never sold even in the leanest year of her girlhood, lay now on the flagstones between the hem of her own grey silk and the hem of Lady Sophia Vance's borrowed blue one. She did not reach for it. Not yet. It was her son who moved first. Peter was 6 years old, and he crossed the width of the receiving hall at a dead run, past the frozen orchestra and the abandoned trays of ratafia, and took his father's hand, the hand that had done it, in both of his own small ones. He said nothing at all. He simply held it, the way one holds a door one is afraid will slam again, and that, more than anything shouted in that room in the next several minutes, was what made the Duke of Wexcombe go white to the lips. By the time frost came to Wexcombe that year, the county would no longer speak of the Duke's temper. They would speak of what his wife had built out of the wreckage of it. But that was 4 seasons distant, and on this particular October evening, in a hall still smelling of beeswax and hothouse lilies, all anyone present knew for certain was that the Duchess had been struck, had not fallen, had not wept, and was now bending, unhurried, to retrieve her own dropped ring from the floor. The autumn of 1819 had come to Wexcombe the way it always came, heavy with the smell of turned earth and indifferent to whatever human arithmetic was being conducted beneath its skies. Eleanor had been Duchess for 3 years by then, married in a transaction so plainly stated that no one had troubled to dress it as romance. Her father, Thomas Farrow, had been a country solicitor of considerable means and no particular blood, a man who had spent 30 years teaching gentlemen to read their own contracts, and had died leaving his only daughter a competence, a library, and a habit of writing everything down. The Duke's family had needed capital rather more than they had needed pedigree that year. His own father having nearly ruined the estate a generation before, through debts no one discussed above a whisper. It was, everyone agreed, a sensible match. No one had asked whether it was a happy one, because no one had thought to. For 3 years Eleanor had kept the house the way her father had taught her to keep a ledger, quietly, accurately, and without expectation of praise. She knew which tenant farms were behind on their rents, and which were merely slow to be asked twice. She knew the going price of wool before the factor's man arrived to name it low. She corrected the steward's arithmetic in the margins of his own books, and never once mentioned it aloud. Julian Vane, Duke of Wexcombe, noticed none of this, because it had never occurred to him to look. He was a cold man, not a cruel one, or he had been, until an October evening made the distinction difficult to maintain. His coldness had a shape to it that Eleanor had never been permitted to see the edges of. She had learned early in the marriage that certain rooms of him were locked, and that asking after the key was itself a kind of trespass. Into this arrangement, in the late summer of that year, came Lady Sophia Vance, a widow of the Duke's own age, welcomed to Wexcombe by the Duke's aunt, Lady Constance, as an old family friend in need of quiet country air. Sophia Vance had known Julian Vane before Eleanor Farrow had, in the years before his father's debts made a solicitor's daughter necessary. She was warm in company. The particular whey cream is warm before it turns, pleasant to the tongue, and easy to mistake for kindness. She was, Eleanor observed within a fortnight, extremely interested in the household books. By September there was a discrepancy in the harvest accounts, £640, unaccounted for, traced by a hand that resembled Eleanor's own, just closely enough to be believed by anyone who was already prepared to believe the worst of her. Lady Constance carried the discovery to her nephew, the way one carries a lit taper into a room full of dry hay, with great solemnity and no apparent understanding of what she was about to do. The harvest gathering was set for the 2nd week of October, 40 guests invited, the good silver taken from storage, candles enough to make the hall look, for one evening, like something out of a better marriage than the one it was hosting. And that was how the evening began, with music and lilies, and no one in the room yet knowing that, before the last course was cleared, the Duchess of Wexcombe would be struck in front of all of them, and would not fall, and would bend, unhurried, to pick up her own ring from the floor. The gathering had reached its 3rd hour before Lady Constance made her move. She waited. Eleanor would understand only later, for the moment when the wine had done its patient work, and the guests were loose enough to remember everything and repeat none of it kindly. She rose from her chair near the Duke's right hand, Sophia Vance seated at his left, a placement no one had questioned aloud, though several had noted it, and she produced, from the reticule at her wrist, a single folded sheet of paper. "Julian," she said, "I would not trouble you with household matters before your guests, were the matter not so very troubling." She said the word troubling twice. Eleanor noticed, the way a woman lays a card down slowly to be sure the table has seen its face. The Duke read the paper in silence. Eleanor watched something in his jaw set the way ground sets before a frost, not suddenly, but completely. "Explain this," he said, and held the sheet toward her across the width of the table, so that she had to rise and cross to take it, in front of 40 people who had stopped pretending to eat. She read it once, carefully, the way her father had taught her to read any document put in front of her by a man in a hurry to be believed. "I have never seen this ledger," she said. "The hand is close to mine. It is not mine. I would ask to see the original entry beside it, and the steward's counterbook from the same quarter, before anyone concludes anything at all." "You would ask," the Duke repeated, and there was something in his voice that was not quite anger yet, only its foundation being poured. "My aunt has shown me £640, gone from an account you alone hold the key to, and you would ask." "I would ask," Eleanor said again, "because that is what the evidence requires, and because I did not take your money, Julian. And a document is not proof merely for having been written down with confidence." It was Sophia Vance who spoke next, softly to no one in particular, in the pleasant, carrying voice of a woman who has rehearsed sounding as though she has not rehearsed anything. "I have always said," she murmured, "that a man in your position needs a wife who can be trusted absolutely, or not trusted at all. There is no useful middle country in a marriage, is there? I did not marry her to love her," the Duke said, not shouting it, which was somehow worse, saying it the flat way a man reads a bill of sale aloud to a room he has forgotten is listening. "I married her to manage my house. And now, it appears, she cannot even do that." The hall had gone very quiet by then, the particular quiet of 40 people, calculating how much of this they were meant to have heard. Eleanor did not raise her voice. "Then you have married a woman for a purpose she has performed faithfully for 3 years, she said, and you are prepared to believe a forgery over her, on the word of a guest who arrived in this county in July, and a ledger no one has troubled to verify. I would ask you to consider what that says of your judgment, before you ask what it says of mine. It was, she would think much later, the word judgment that did it. He crossed the space between them in 2 steps and struck her across the face with the back of his hand, and the room made the sound a room makes when air is taken out of it all at once. She did not scream. She did not stumble against the table she had laid herself. She did not weep, though her eyes stung fiercely, and her ears rang with a high thin note that had nothing to do with the orchestra. She touched her cheek once, lightly, and let her hand fall. Her father's ring, loosed from its ribbon in the turn of her body, struck the flagstones and rolled to rest between her own hymn and Sophia Vance's borrowed blue silk. It was Peter who moved first, small and fast and utterly, without ceremony, and took his father's hand in both of his, and held it, and said nothing at all. The Duke of Wexcombe went white to the lips, and did not move again for the length of several long breaths. Eleanor bent, unhurried, and picked up her ring, and closed her fingers around it, and looked at the assembled 40 guests with a composure that cost her more than any of them would ever know the price of. "Forgive the interruption to your evening," she said, in a voice that did not shake. "I find I have accounts of my own to attend to." And she took her son's free hand, and walked out of the hall she had decorated with her own hands that morning, and did not look back once. In her chamber she allowed herself exactly a quarter of an hour by the mantel clock, which had been her father's habit before her, grief taken in a measured dose, like medicine. Never more than the day could afford. She sat with Peter's head against her shoulder, and let the tears come for those 15 minutes precisely. And then she stood, and washed her face in cold water, and put the feeling away, in the place she had always kept such things, a locked drawer of the mind she had built for herself in girlhood, and never once needed so badly as she needed it now. Mrs. Prudence Hale, the housekeeper, found her an hour later at the small writing desk in her sitting room, a fresh sheet of paper before her, dated and headed in her own steady hand. "You ought to be resting, Your Grace, Mrs.," Hale said, setting down a tray she had not been asked to bring. "I ought to be believed," Eleanor said. "Since I am not, I will settle for being accurate." She dipped her pen. "My father used to say that paper remembers what people conveniently forget. I find I have a great deal I would like remembered." Mrs. Hale, who had served 3 duchesses and buried a husband, and never once in 40 years raised her voice above a certain register, looked at the ledger page taking shape under the duchess's hand, and said only, "Then I expect you'd best begin, Your Grace." It was, from her, the equivalent of a standing ovation. Eleanor began. The first entry was the date, the hour, and a plain description of what had occurred, written the way her father had taught her to write anything that might one day need to stand up in a room full of people inclined to doubt her. It was, she thought, laying down her pen at last near midnight, the very first page of a wholly different account than the one that had been read aloud against her that evening. The weeks that followed asked nothing of the Duke's household so gently as a flooded corn store did. The November rains came early and hard that year, and the low granary at Marrow's Bottom took water through a roof no one had thought urgent enough to mend, threatening 400 bushels the estate could not afford to lose. The steward, Miss Wallace, a heavy, careful man who had served the Wexcombe estate for 11 years and trusted very little that had not been tested twice, came to Eleanor because the Duke had shut himself in his study and would see no one, and because, Wallace admitted afterward, He had simply run out of other people to ask. She did not weep over the ruined roof any more than she had wept over her own struck cheek. She asked for the granary's dimensions, the price the estate had paid for its last repair, and the going rate for thatch and timber that season, and by the light of a single candle she reworked Wallace's figures twice, and found him a saving of £11 by sending to the mill town rather than the nearer, costlier tradesman he had always used out of habit rather than economy. She arranged for the grain to be moved to the tithe barn within 2 days, at a labour cost lower than Wallace's own estimate, because she thought to offer the tenant boys a fair day's wage rather than the customary shortchange, and found them consequently willing to work through a Sunday. "I confess, Your Grace," Wallace said, some days later, watching the new thatch go up dry and tight against a sky that had finally cleared, "I did not think a lady bred to town accounts would know a granary roof from a hayrick." "My father was a solicitor, Missa Wallace, not a lady of fashion," Eleanor said. "He taught me that a number is a number whether it concerns a rent roll or a roof, and that the man who tells you differently is usually hoping you won't check his arithmetic." Wallace did not smile, being a man who rarely did, but something in the set of his shoulders eased, the way a door eases when a swollen frame finally gives. He did not doubt her again, in word or in the small daily deference of a man who has decided where his trust is properly owed. Word of the granary travelled the way water moves downhill, without needing to be pushed. By the 2nd week of December, tenants at Marrow's Bottom were telling tenants at Ashcott that the Duchess had saved the harvest with a pencil and a candle while the Duke sat locked in his study, and the telling did not lose accuracy in the travelling, only warmth. The Duke himself noticed nothing directly. He noticed, rather, the way a man notices weather changing behind a shuttered window, a difference in the quality of light before he has trouble to open the shutter and look. He saw the corrected ledger in Wallace's hand, and recognised, without wanting to, the neat, unhesitating figures as his wife's. He heard, from a groom who did not know he was being overheard, that the tenants at Marrow's Bottom had taken to calling her the Duchess with the candle. He said nothing of any of it to anyone. But he did not scowl one evening, when she entered the breakfast-room before him, which was itself so unusual a thing that Mrs. Hale mentioned it to the cook, who mentioned it to no one, because she did not believe it herself. A letter arrived for Eleanor in the 3rd week of December, in a small, careful, old-fashioned hand she had not seen in some years. It was from Aldous Gray, who had clerked for her father for 2 decades, and now kept a small practice of his own in the county town, precise and incorruptible, and entirely unmoved by titles. "Your Grace," it read, "I have had occasion, in settling an old matter of your late father's papers, to come across something I believe concerns the account presently in dispute at Wexcombe. I would not commit it to a letter that might be read by other eyes. I would ask that you call upon me, at your earliest convenience, and bring nothing with you but your own memory of your father's hand." She read it twice, folded it once, and sat a long moment with her palm flat against the desk, the way a woman rests her hand against a door she is about to open onto a room she has waited a long time to see the inside of. "Mrs. Hale," she said, "I find I have business in the county town." Winter deepened at Wexcombe, and with it came a second, smaller trial that told the county rather more than the first had. The roof at Marrow's Bottom had been mended. Now the tenants who had mended it were owed. Wallace had, in previous years, paid day labour at 8p, a wage he defended as customary, and Eleanor considered indefensible given the price of bread that season. She raised it to £1 without asking the Duke's leave, because the household accounts were on paper if not yet in practice, hers to keep, and because her father had taught her that a man who underpays honest labour is merely borrowing trouble at interest. Word of the raised wage reached the Duke before word of the reasoning behind it did, and for one evening it seemed the household might tip back into the old suspicion. But Wallace, unbidden, told him plainly that the men had worked a wet Sunday for that shilling, and would have worked a second for less thanks, and would not have worked at all. The previous winter, for the old wage, and Wallace's own poor management of it. The Duke said nothing in reply, but he did not countermand the wage, and that, from him, was its own kind of sentence. It was Mrs. Hale who finally told Eleanor what she had long suspected of the man she had married, though she told it sideways, the way the old housekeeper told most things that mattered. His Grace's mother left this house when he was 7, she said, folding linen with great attention to the folding. Left for a richer man and a warmer climate, and left his father to discover, some months after, that she had taken rather more from the strong-box on her way out than anyone had thought to guard. His father never trusted a devoted-looking woman again as long as he lived, and taught his son the same lesson before the boy was old enough to know it was only one man's grief dressed up as wisdom. I do not excuse his Grace, your Grace. I only tell you what shaped the hand that struck you, so that you might know it was fear, not hatred, that swung it. Eleanor sat with that a long while. Fear does not excuse a blow, she said finally. No, Mrs., Hale agreed. It only explains why he was so ready to believe one lie, and so slow to disbelieve it once it had been dressed as another man's ledger. Lady Sophia Vance, meanwhile, had not been idle through the granary's mending or the wages raising. She had gone, twice now, to Lady Constance, with soft suggestions that the Duchess's sudden competence was itself suspicious, that a woman so quick with figures might be quick with forged ones as well, and had begun, delicately, to raise the question of whether Eleanor might not be more comfortably settled at the Dower House until the matter of the missing £640 was properly resolved. The Duke had not yet agreed to it. But he had not yet refused it either, and the county, sharp-eared as counties are, had begun to notice that too. Eleanor drove to the county town on a hard bright morning in early January, the frost still silvering the hedgerows, and found Aldous Gray exactly where she had left him in memory a decade before, small, spectacled, surrounded by boxes of paper he treated with more tenderness than most men treat their children. "Your father kept everything, your Grace," he said, by way of greeting, which was a great trial to me for 20 years, and is now, I find, rather useful. He laid a ledger before her, its cover soft with age. This is his own firm's account book from the year in question. Every entry in his hand, every sum reconciled to the penny, as was his habit. He turned to a marked page. There is no £640 unaccounted for anywhere in your father's dealings with Wexcombe, your Grace. There never was. Whatever discrepancy exists, it was invented whole, and invented recently, in a hand made to resemble yours by someone who had clearly studied your correspondence rather too closely. Eleanor sat very still. "Then the fraud is not mine, and it is not even old," she said. "It is being committed now, against me, by someone inside my own house." "That would be my reading of it," Gray said. "I would ask, your Grace, before you act on it, that we be very certain and very patient. A false accusation answered too quickly looks like panic, answered with proof, and in its own time it looks like the truth simply arriving where it was always going." She returned to Wexcombe that evening with the old ledger wrapped carefully against the cold, and found the Duke waiting for her in the hall. Not by chance, she understood at once, but by design, having clearly waited some hours for it. "I have had your father's ring restrung," he said without preamble, and held it out to her on a fine new silver chain, the ribbon that had snapped in October, replaced with something meant to last. The ribbon broke when it fell. "I did not think you should have to mend it yourself. On top of everything else I have made you mend." She did not take it at once. "That is not an apology, Julian." "No," he agreed. "I do not think I have yet earned the right to give you one you would believe. I thought I would begin somewhere smaller." He held the ring a moment longer. "Show me," she said finally, taking it, closing her hand around the familiar weight of her father's brass. "Not tonight, and not with words. Show me over time, in ordinary days, and I will tell you when I believe it." He did not argue the terms. He only nodded, the way a man nods at a contract he has read and understood to be fair, and let her pass. The proof, once the assembling of it began in earnest, came the way her father had always told her proof comes, not in a single blinding document, but in a slow accumulation of small, dull, unimpeachable facts. Gray traced the forged ledger's true origin to an entry supposedly recording £900 paid for repairs to the east barns, work that the mason of record, a plain, irritable man named Coombs, swore under Gray's careful questioning had never been commissioned, and certainly never performed. "I'd remember £900 of work I never lifted a trowel for," Coombs said, not troubling to hide his contempt for the suggestion otherwise. "I'd remember it the way a man remembers a debt he's owed and never paid." The hand behind the forged entries, once Gray and Eleanor set the ledgers side by side under good daylight, showed the particular tells of a writer trying very hard to disguise a natural slant that betrayed itself in every looping capital. It was, once seen, unmistakably Sophia Vance's own hand, imperfectly disguised, working in concert with a dismissed under-steward named Josiah Fenn, turned off the estate the previous spring for petty dishonesty, and evidently willing, for a price, to turn his skill with a pen toward a larger one. They found Fenn at a coaching inn 2 counties distant, run to ground by a stable boy who remembered him and was glad, for £1 and the promise of no trouble for himself, to say where he had gone. It was Mr. Edmund Locke, a precise, unhurried solicitor engaged by Gray for exactly this purpose, who conducted the questioning, and Fenn, faced with the original ledgers, and a lawyer who plainly already knew the answers to every question he asked, confessed within the hour to forging the £900 entry at Lady Sophia Vance's instruction and for her payment. In the hope of seeing the Duchess removed from the house, and the Duke's confidence restored to a woman he had once, before his marriage, hoped to keep it. Sophia Vance, sensing the ground shifting beneath her, though not yet the whole of how far it had shifted, moved first with the only weapon she had left. She went to the Duke privately, tearful in a way Eleanor never was, and suggested that the Duchess herself, desperate to conceal her own guilt, had likely forged the counter-evidence now being assembled against her, and further, delicately, that the county might do well to wonder whether a boy of 6 had truly intervened between father and mother out of instinct, or whether he had been coached to it by a woman skilled in arranging a scene to her own advantage. It was the mention of Peter that told Eleanor, more than anything else, precisely what kind of woman she was dealing with. She received the account of it from Mrs. Hale, with her hands very still in her lap, and allowed herself exactly the length of one held breath before she said, "She has made a serious error." She has decided that because I do not weep, I do not feel. I feel a great deal, Mrs. Hale. I have simply decided to spend it on something more useful than tears. Then she asked Gray and Locke to prepare everything for a public hearing, because a private word from the Duke would settle nothing that the county's own whispering had not already unsettled. The hearing was set for the last week of January, in the assembly rooms at the county town, before the sitting magistrate and such of the gentry and tenantry as cared to attend, which proved to be nearly all of them. Eleanor dressed plainly that morning, in grey, her father's ring on its new silver chain visible at her throat rather than hidden beneath her collar, and she thought, fastening it, that she had spent 3 months building toward precisely this ordinary morning without once knowing that was what she was doing. The assembly rooms were full by the appointed hour. The gentry seated near the front out of habit, the tenant families further back out of the same habit, though Eleanor had privately hoped, and rather thought, that the distance would not matter today. Lady Constance sat near the Duke, her composure already fraying at its edges. Sophia Vance sat a little apart, in blue again, her chin at the particular angle of a woman who has decided to brazen out a thing she suspects is already lost. Eleanor rose when Locke called upon her, and laid her father's original ledger on the table before the magistrate, open to the marked page, beside the forged household account it contradicted line for line. "I will not ask this room to take my word over a document," she said, her voice carrying without effort into every corner of the hall. "I will ask it to compare 2 documents, in 2 different hands, and decide for itself which one was written by a man keeping honest accounts for 20 years, and which one was written by someone in a hurry to be believed." Coombs the mason spoke next, plainly, and without polish, confirming he had never been paid nor commissioned for the barn repairs the forged ledger claimed. A stable boy, no more than 14, and plainly terrified to be addressed by a magistrate, testified in a small clear voice that he had twice seen Lady Sophia Vance meet privately with Josiah Fenn near the old Dovecote in the months before the harvest gathering. Exchanges he had thought nothing of at the time, and had mentioned to no one until Mrs. Hale asked him gently whether he had seen anything at all out of the ordinary. Fenn's own signed confession, taken by Locke, and witnessed by 2 men of standing, was read into the record in a flat, unhurried voice that made its contents somehow more damning than any amount of drama could have. The room's turning was audible before it was visible, a low current of murmuring that moved from the back benches forward, from the tenants who had known all along which account of the Duchess to believe, toward the gentry who had been rather slower to decide. Lady Constance's face had gone the colour of old linen. Sophia Vance's composure, which had survived every previous blow, finally cracked at the reading of Fenn's confession, some fixed and burning thing behind her eyes simply going out, the way a candle goes out not with a flare, but with a small final surrender of smoke. The magistrate turned to Eleanor. "Your Grace would be within your rights to see this matter prosecuted to its fullest extent. Forgery is no small charge, and the sum in question no small sum." Eleanor considered this a long moment, aware of the whole room watching to see what shape her power would take now that it had been proven. "I have no wish to see anyone in this room destroyed," she said finally. "I wish to see the truth acknowledged, the money restored, and the matter closed without further cost to people who have already paid a great deal in reputation for their part in it, willing or otherwise. I would ask that Lady Sophia Vance make full restitution of the sum taken, and that she remove herself from this county within the month, and that the matter end there without further proceedings, provided she troubles this family no further." She paused, I could ask for more. I find I do not want it. It was mercy, and the whole room understood it as such precisely because it was dispensed from a position that could have demanded far worse, and because its cost, repayment, exile, the permanent forfeiture of standing, was named aloud rather than left to seem like weakness dressed as kindness. The Duke rose then, for the first time in the entire proceeding, and said, in a voice that reached every corner of the hall without being raised, "I owe my wife an accounting I have not yet given her, and I intend to give it, though not in this room. I will say here only that I was wrong, publicly and completely, and that the fault for the harm done to her rests with no one in this hearing but myself, for believing what was easiest to believe rather than what the evidence required. It was not the whole of what needed saying. But it was. Everyone in that room understood. The first true thing he had said aloud regarding his marriage in longer than anyone could remember. He came to her that evening in the small sitting room where she had once written the first page of her own account, and found her at the same desk, though the ledger before her now was nearly full. "I owe you an explanation," he said, "and I understand it is not the same thing as an apology, and that you will want both, and that I have no right to expect you to accept either." "I do want both," she said. "Go on." He told her then the whole of it, standing rather than sitting, as though the story required him to be on his feet to bear its weight. His mother had left when he was 7, taking with her a sum from his father's strong-box, large enough to nearly finish the ruin his father's own poor management had begun. His father had raised him afterward on a single doctrine, repeated so often it had worn a groove in him, the way water wears a groove in stone, that a woman's devotion was the most dangerous thing in a house, precisely because it was the hardest to see through until it was too late. He had married Eleanor believing capability was safer than affection, because capability could be measured and affection could not, and when Lady Constance had brought him a piece of paper suggesting her capability was itself a lie, he had believed it faster and more completely than he would ever have believed a stranger, because some old frightened part of him had been waiting 27 years for exactly that proof to arrive. "That is the explanation," Eleanor said, when he had finished. "It is not nothing. It does not excuse the hand that struck me, and I think you know that, or you would not have told it standing up like a man confessing to a magistrate rather than a man asking his wife's pardon." "I know it," he said. "The apology is separate, and it is this. I am sorry. Not sorry that it looks badly for me, which I understand is a different thing entirely, but sorry that I raised my hand to you in a room full of people who will remember it the rest of their lives, sorry that I believed a stranger's paper over 3 years of your own conduct, and sorry that it took my son's hand in mine to stop me, when it ought never to have needed stopping at all." She sat with that a moment, her hand resting on the ring at her throat. "Then here are my terms, since you have given me both things I asked for," she said, and she counted them the way her father had taught her to count anything of consequence, aloud, and in order. "The household ledgers and the tenant wages are mine to keep, formally and permanently, not by your sufferance but by settlement, in writing, witnessed by Mr. Locke. You will hear me before you act on any accusation brought against me, by anyone, ever again. You will not take your aunt's counsel over mine in any matter touching this house without my being present to answer it, and Peter will grow up knowing the whole of this, not to carry it as a wound, but so that he never mistakes silence for peace, in this house or any other." "All right," the Duke said. "All right, then," Eleanor said, and something in the room eased, the way a door eases when a swollen frame finally gives. Lady Constance came 2 days later, alone, and stood in the doorway of the sitting-room a long moment before she could bring herself to speak. I believed what was easiest to believe, because you came from trade rather than blood, and I had decided long before any ledger was forged that a solicitor's daughter could not truly belong here, she said. That is not an excuse. It is only, I think, the truth of it, which you have taught this family to value rather more than we used to. Eleanor did not tell her the apology mended everything. She only said, "Thank you for saying it plainly," which was, from her, exactly as much forgiveness as had yet been earned. And no more. Winter thinned towards spring at Wexcombe, and the proof of what had changed arrived not in any single dramatic gesture, but in the accumulation of very small ones, each meaning nothing alone and everything together. The Duke began bringing her tea before she asked for it, and learned after several tries precisely how she liked it. He took to sitting beside her over the ledgers in the evening, not correcting her figures, which had never needed correcting, but simply present, learning the names of tenants he had never troubled to learn before. He said once, discussing a boundary dispute with a farmer near Ashcott, "I reckon we ought to hear his side of it first." And Eleanor, hearing the plain country phrase sit so unnaturally and so sincerely in her husband's mouth, understood it for the small, real thing it was. There was one relapse, in March, when a tenant family fell behind on their rent, through no fault but a hard winter, and the Duke, out of some old paternal habit he had not yet fully unlearned, forgave the arrears himself, without consulting her, the way his own father might once have done, deciding for a household he had sworn to decide nothing in without her. She named it calmly that evening, not as betrayal but as pattern. That decision was mine to share in the making of. Julian, whatever the outcome. You did not do wrong by the family. You did wrong by our agreement. He did not argue. He went the next morning and told Wallace, in front of 2 other men, that the Duchess's word stood equal to his own in every matter touching the estate's accounts, and that anyone who forgot it a second time would answer to him for it. She wept in front of him only once. In April, all of it at once. The struck cheek, the forged ledger, the long quarter hours of counted grief finally spent past their ration, and he did not try to fix it or hurry it. He sat beside her and was simply still, the way a house is still when a storm has finally passed over it and left it standing. "I told someone once that I did not marry you to love you," he said, when she had gone quiet again. "I have never regretted a sentence more in my life. You are not useful to me, Eleanor. You are necessary, and there is a difference, and I have only just learnt it well enough to say it properly. I choose you. I have been choosing you in small ways for months now, and I mean to keep choosing you every morning I wake in this house, for as long as you'll allow it." "All right," she said. "All right, then," he said, and it was, between them, the whole of a treaty. 2 years passed the way years do at a working estate, marked more by harvests than by dates. Lady Sophia Vance lived quietly now in a distant town, her name unspoken in Wexcombe society, the £900 long since repaid in full. Josiah Fenn, having confessed honestly when it cost him everything to do so, found work as a clerk in Gray's own practice, watched carefully and given, at last, the chance to be exactly as honest as he had once failed to be. Lady Constance came to dinner twice a year now, humbled in a way that suited her better than her old certainty ever had. Aldous Gray retired the following spring, and the new school building at Wexcombe bore. at his own quiet insistence, a small brass plaque with his name on it beside the Duchess's. For it was a school, in the end, that Wexcombe built to outlast the whole affair. A plain stone building at the crossroads near Marrow's Bottom, its charter funded from the estate, and its first lesson, taught by Eleanor herself in its opening week, an arithmetic lesson, because she had always believed a person who could check her own figures could never again be made to believe a lie merely for having been written down with confidence. Beside the school stood a board, renewed each quarter day, listing every labourer's fair wage in plain figures for any tenant to check against his own pay, a practice the county's other estates were, rather sheepishly, beginning to copy. The charter for the school was sealed, on the day of its opening, with a single brass seal ring pressed into warm wax by the Duke's own hand, Eleanor's hand steadying his, her father's mark stamped now, not upon a solicitor's private contract, but upon a public promise that would outlive every person who had signed it. Peter, 8 years old now, kept his own small ledger of the estate's affairs, a habit his mother had begun teaching him almost as soon as he could hold a pen. And the house at Wexcombe, which had once held its breath through every cold season of that marriage, was said by everyone who visited it now to feel, quite simply, like a house that had finally learned to exhale. She had not asked to be struck into being seen. No one asks for that, and no one should have to earn safety through what she survived that October evening. But having been struck, she had refused every easier road afterward. She had not screamed, and she had not fled, and she had not waited to be pitied back into visibility. She had built, instead, the slow, unglamorous way, with ledgers and patience, and a ring that had once marked a dead man's private business, and now sealed a whole county's public fairness. Not because a blow deserved thanks, but because a life, once nearly erased, is owed the dignity of being written back in by its own hand. Not because love arrived to rescue her, but because she had made herself, long before love returned, a woman impossible to overlook, impossible to misprice, impossible to unsee. She had stopped asking to be valued. She had made herself, ledger by ledger, day by ordinary day, a fact no one in that county could any longer afford to get wrong. And a fact, once proven, is not a thing that can be struck back down.